A photograph arrived at Matthew Brady's studio in Washington in late October of 1863, delivered by a messenger whose face no one could quite describe afterward. No one knew who had taken it. No one knew how it had been preserved in a worn leather envelope, its edges yellowed and marked with moisture stains that suggested decades of concealment. But what the camera had captured that day, on a plantation deep in the Virginia countryside, far from the eyes of war, was something that three powerful families would spend the rest of their lives trying to destroy. The photograph would disappear in 1864, but its effects would never cease. Before we continue with the story of this lost photograph and the secrets it held, if you're listening from somewhere special, leave a comment telling us which state or city you're from. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any stories like this one. Now let's discover what that camera saw. The story begins not in 1863, but in 1847, when Thomas Ashton was merely an ambitious young lawyer in Richmond, Virginia. He had grown up in a family of modest landowners, nothing comparable to the wealth of the great slaveholders who dominated state politics. But Thomas possessed something money could not buy: a sharp intellect and an almost supernatural ability to infiltrate circles of power. That year he met Eleanor Hartwell at a charity ball. Eleanor was the daughter of one of Virginia's richest men, a tobacco magnate named Richard Hartwell. She was 22 years old, with chestnut hair that fell in perfect waves over her shoulders and a smile that made men forget to breathe. But there was something in Eleanor's eyes, a hardness, an intelligence that rivaled Thomas's own. She was not the fragile maiden society expected her to be. Thomas courted her for 3 months. Their meetings were careful, discreet, always in public places where appearances could be maintained. Eleanor challenged him intellectually in ways no woman of her class had before. She read political newspapers, understood economics, held strong opinions about the direction the nation was taking. When Thomas finally asked for her hand, Richard Hartwell accepted, not because he loved the young lawyer, but because Thomas had become indispensable to his legal affairs. The wedding took place in May of 1848. The ceremony was grand, held at Richmond's Baptist Church with more than 300 guests. No one could have predicted that this union would produce one of Virginia's greatest silent tragedies. Eleanor became pregnant quickly. Their first child, a boy named William, was born in March of 1849. 2 years later came their daughter, Catherine. Thomas appeared to be a devoted husband, a loving father. He built a mansion in Henrico County, just 20 kilometers from Richmond, a property with 14 rooms, a spacious barn, and land that stretched as far as the eye could see. The house had a name, Riverside, but there was something no one knew about Thomas Ashton. Something he guarded with the care of a man protecting his own heart. Thomas had an older brother named Samuel. Samuel had disappeared in 1844, when Thomas was only 19 years old. The family had said he had gone to try his luck in California during the gold rush, but the truth was different. Samuel had been arrested for theft, a theft that Thomas knew his brother had not committed, and Thomas had done nothing to help him. He had let his brother rot in a prison in Petersburg while he built his own reputation. Samuel died in that prison in 1846 at the age of 25. Thomas had never told anyone, not even Eleanor. Life at Riverside seemed idyllic in those first years. Thomas was a successful businessman, his clients including some of Virginia's most important names. Eleanor was an impeccable hostess. Her parties were legendary throughout the region. William and Catherine grew up in an environment of privilege and refined education. But in 1855, something changed. Thomas began spending long nights away from home. His business, he said, kept him occupied. Eleanor did not question him, or at least not openly. But the servants noticed. They noticed how she would stay awake late into the night, walking through the corridors of Riverside, her footsteps echoing on the wooden stairs. They noticed how she gazed out the parlor window, waiting for the sound of Thomas's carriage wheels on the gravel road. Thomas had a secret, and that secret had a name: Margaret. Margaret was the daughter of one of Richard Hartwell's overseers on the neighboring property to Riverside. She was 20 years old in 1855, with fair skin and black hair that gleamed like obsidian. She had grown up watching the Hartwell family's wealth from a distance, always conscious of her inferior position in the social hierarchy. But when Thomas Ashton began visiting her father's cottage in the evenings, something shifted in her world. Thomas was careful. He always had a reason for being there, discussing property lines, reviewing contracts, matters of business that required discretion. But the servants knew. They always knew. And they whispered. The whispers reached Eleanor in fragments, carried by maids and groundskeepers who spoke in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening. At first, she dismissed them. Thomas was a man of business. It was natural that he would have dealings with neighboring properties. But as the months turned into years, as 1855 became 1856 and then 1857, Eleanor's certainty began to crack. In 1858, Margaret gave birth to a son. The child was born at her father's cottage, delivered by a midwife who had been paid handsomely to keep her silence. The boy had Thomas's sharp features, his dark eyes, his distinctive way of tilting his head when he listened. There was no denying the truth written across the child's face. Eleanor learned of the birth through the same whisper network that had informed her of everything else. She did not confront Thomas. Instead, she withdrew into herself, becoming a ghost in her own home. She spent her days in the library at Riverside, reading books that had nothing to do with the life she was living. She spent her nights staring at the ceiling of her bedroom, listening to the sounds of the house settling around her, wondering how her marriage had become such a carefully constructed lie. Thomas, for his part, seemed oblivious to his wife's suffering, or perhaps he simply did not care. He continued his visits to Margaret's cottage. He continued to provide for the boy, whose name was James. He continued to live two lives, moving between them with the ease of a man who had long ago compartmentalized his conscience. The situation might have continued indefinitely, a secret maintained through the complicity of servants who knew better than to speak, and a wife who had learned to live with her husband's infidelity through sheer force of will. But in 1860, a new element entered the equation. That element was a man named Robert Vance. Robert Vance was a photographer. He had come to Virginia from Philadelphia, drawn by the promise of documenting the lives of the state's prominent families. Photography was still a relatively new art form in 1860, and wealthy families were eager to have their portraits taken by skilled practitioners. Vance was exceptionally skilled. His photographs had a quality of intimacy that made his subjects appear not as they wished to be seen, but as they truly were. Robert Vance was also, unbeknownst to almost everyone, the illegitimate son of a free black woman and a white merchant from Boston. He had been raised in Philadelphia by his mother, educated in private schools, trained in the photographic arts by one of the finest practitioners in the country. He had come to Virginia not merely to take photographs, but to document the reality of slavery and the lives of those who benefited from it. A documentation he intended to use for abolitionist purposes once the war came, as he believed it inevitably would. Vance was 32 years old in 1860, with an intensity in his eyes that made people uncomfortable. He was polite, professional, and utterly committed to his craft. He was also deeply opposed to slavery, though he kept this conviction hidden beneath a veneer of professional neutrality. Thomas Ashton hired Vance to take a portrait of his family in the spring of 1860. The sitting took place at Riverside, in the parlor with its high windows and elegant furnishings. Eleanor sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, her expression carefully arranged into something resembling contentment. William and Catherine stood behind their parents, their young faces serious with the effort of remaining still. Thomas stood to the side, his hand resting on Eleanor's shoulder in a gesture that was meant to convey affection, but which Vance's camera captured as something else entirely, a gesture of possession, of control. When Vance developed the photograph, he saw something that Thomas and Eleanor did not. He saw the tension in Eleanor's jaw, the way her eyes did not quite meet her husband's gaze. He saw the subtle distance between them, a space that no amount of careful positioning could entirely conceal. He saw a marriage that was, in its essence, a performance. Vance said nothing about what he had observed. He delivered the photograph to Thomas, accepted his payment, and moved on to his next commission. But he had begun to pay attention to the Ashton family in a way that would, 3 years later, change everything. If you're enjoying this story so far, now is the perfect time to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We have hundreds of stories like this one, mysteries, secrets, and historical events that will keep you up at night. The best part? You won't want to miss what happens next. Let's continue. The war came in April of 1861, just as Robert Vance had predicted. Fort Sumter fell, and Virginia seceded from the Union. The state transformed almost overnight from a place of relative peace into a landscape of military preparation and ideological fervor. Thomas Ashton, like many men of his class and position, found himself in a complicated situation. He was not a slaveholder on the scale of Richard Hartwell or other great planters, but he benefited from the system nonetheless. His wealth, his position, his entire way of life was built upon foundations that the war was now threatening to destroy. He made a choice that many men in his position made. He remained neutral, or as neutral as one could be in a state torn apart by civil war. He did not volunteer for the Confederate Army. He did not openly support the Union. Instead, he used his legal skills to navigate the increasingly complex landscape of wartime Virginia, representing clients on both sides of the conflict when he could, and carefully avoiding situations that would force him to declare his true allegiances. Eleanor, meanwhile, had found a kind of peace in the chaos of war. With Thomas increasingly occupied by his legal work and the general upheaval of society, she was left largely to her own devices. She devoted herself to charitable work, organizing relief efforts for wounded soldiers, collecting supplies for the Confederate cause. It was work that gave her purpose, that allowed her to exist in a world beyond the walls of Riverside and the knowledge of her husband's infidelity. But Margaret's situation had become increasingly precarious. As the war progressed and Virginia became a battleground, the social order that had allowed Margaret to exist in a kind of limbo, neither fully enslaved nor fully free, dependent on Thomas's protection and discretion, began to collapse. Her father's position as an overseer became increasingly unstable. The plantation where he worked was requisitioned by Confederate forces in 1862. Margaret and her son James, now 4 years old, found themselves without a home or a clear means of support. Thomas, faced with the possibility that his secret might be exposed by circumstance if not by choice, made another decision. He arranged for Margaret and James to be taken north to Philadelphia, where Robert Vance had connections in the abolitionist community. It was a generous gesture, and it was also a way of ensuring that the evidence of his infidelity would be removed from Virginia, where it might be discovered by Eleanor or, worse, by his business associates. Margaret left Virginia in the autumn of 1862, carrying with her a letter of introduction from Thomas and enough money to establish herself in Philadelphia. She took James with her, and she took something else as well, a small daguerreotype of Thomas that he had given her years before, a portrait taken when he was younger, before his marriage to Eleanor, before the weight of his secrets had begun to show in his face. Eleanor never knew that Margaret had left. Thomas did not tell her. As far as Eleanor was concerned, the whispers simply stopped. The evidence of her husband's infidelity was gone, removed from her daily reality, and she allowed herself to believe that perhaps the affair had ended, that perhaps Thomas had finally chosen their marriage over his other life. She was wrong. In the spring of 1863, Robert Vance made a decision that would alter the course of several lives. He had been in Philadelphia for the past year, working as a photographer and secretly documenting the lives of freed slaves and abolitionists. He had become deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, using his camera as a tool for social change. He had photographed families who had escaped slavery, had documented the conditions in refugee camps, had created a visual record of the humanity of those whom the Confederacy sought to deny as fully human. But Vance had not forgotten Virginia. He had not forgotten the Ashton family or the tension he had observed in that parlor 3 years before. And he had not forgotten Margaret, whom he had helped to escape, and who had told him in confidence the full story of her relationship with Thomas Ashton. Margaret had also told him about Eleanor. She had described a woman trapped in a marriage built on lies. A woman who had discovered her husband's infidelity, but who had been powerless to act on that knowledge. She had described Eleanor with a kind of sympathy, recognizing in her a fellow victim of Thomas's deception, even if Eleanor's victimhood was of a fundamentally different character than her own. In the summer of 1863, Vance received a commission that would bring him back to Virginia. A Union general preparing for a campaign in the state had hired him to document the landscape and the people he encountered. It was dangerous work. Virginia was a war zone, and a man carrying photographic equipment was a conspicuous target. But Vance accepted the commission, seeing in it an opportunity to return to the place where his story had begun. In August of 1863, Vance found himself near Henrico County, not far from Riverside. The Union Army was moving through the area, requisitioning supplies and gathering intelligence. Vance was documenting the landscape, the abandoned plantations, the signs of war's devastation. And then, by chance or by design, the historical record does not make clear which, he encountered Thomas Ashton. Thomas was traveling to a neighboring property, conducting business that had become increasingly difficult to manage in the chaos of war. He was riding alone, which was unusual for a man of his status, but the times were unusual. Vance, recognizing him immediately, approached him on the road. What passed between them in that encounter, we do not know. Vance's own account, written years later, is vague on the details. But we know that Thomas did not turn him away. We know that Thomas agreed to something, to pose for a photograph, or to allow Vance access to Riverside, or to participate in some other arrangement that Vance proposed. Perhaps Thomas believed that cooperating with Vance would ensure his silence. Perhaps he was curious about what Vance had done with his life in the intervening years. Perhaps he simply did not have the strength to refuse. Whatever the reason, Thomas allowed Vance to come to Riverside. The date was August 15, 1863. The war had been raging for over 2 years. Virginia was exhausted, its resources depleted, its landscape scarred by military campaigns and skirmishes. Riverside, by contrast, had been largely spared the worst of the conflict. Its distance from major roads and its lack of strategic importance had allowed it to remain relatively untouched by the violence that was consuming the rest of the state. Vance arrived at Riverside in the late afternoon, carrying his photographic equipment in a leather case. He was accompanied by a young assistant, a boy of perhaps 16 named Henry, who had been hired in Richmond to help transport the heavy equipment. Eleanor was in the garden when they arrived. She was cutting flowers, roses primarily, which grew in profusion along the south wall of the house. She was wearing a simple dress of pale blue cotton, and her hair was uncovered loose around her shoulders. She looked in that moment like a woman who had found some small measure of peace. Thomas emerged from the house to greet Vance. His face, when he saw the photographer, registered a moment of surprise, quickly masked. But Eleanor, watching from the garden, saw that moment of surprise. She saw her husband's reaction to this stranger, and something in her intuition, honed by years of reading the subtle signs of his deception, told her that this man meant something. That this man knew something. Thomas introduced Vance as a photographer who wished to document the families of Virginia during wartime. It was a plausible explanation, and Eleanor had no reason to doubt it. But she watched Vance carefully as he set up his equipment in the parlor, the same parlor where he had photographed the family 3 years before. She watched the way he moved, the intensity of his focus, the way his eyes seemed to take in not just the physical space but something deeper, something hidden. Vance worked methodically. He arranged the furniture, adjusted the light coming through the windows, positioned reflectors to create the effect he desired. He was, by all accounts, a consummate professional. But there was something else in his manner, something that suggested he was doing more than simply taking a photograph. He was, in some sense, staging something, creating a tableau that would reveal a truth. He asked to photograph Thomas and Eleanor together. This was not unusual. Family portraits were the standard commission. But the way he positioned them was unusual. He placed them not side by side, as was conventional, but with Eleanor seated and Thomas standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder. It was the same composition he had used 3 years before, but this time he made a subtle change. He asked Eleanor to look away from the camera, to gaze toward the window. He asked Thomas to look directly into the lens. The effect was striking. In the resulting photograph, Thomas appears almost predatory, his gaze fixed and intense, while Eleanor appears distant, disconnected, her attention drawn away from her husband and towards something beyond the frame of the image. The composition creates a narrative, a woman trapped, a man watching, a relationship defined by control rather than affection. But that was not the photograph that would change everything. After the formal sitting was complete, Vance asked to photograph the servants. This was an unusual request. Servants were rarely included in family portraits, and when they were, they appeared in the background, barely visible, their presence acknowledged only as a marker of the family's wealth and status. But Vance was insistent. He wanted to document, he said, the full life of the household. He wanted to show how the family lived, who served them, what the structure of their daily existence looked like. Thomas, perhaps sensing that refusal would seem suspicious, agreed. The servants were assembled in the kitchen, the cook, the housemaids, the groundskeeper, the stable boy. They stood in an awkward line, uncomfortable with being the focus of attention, uncertain of how to position themselves or what expression to adopt. Vance moved among them, adjusting their positions, asking them to relax, to be natural. And then he asked for one more person. He asked for the woman who had come to Riverside 3 days before, the woman who had arrived from Richmond with a young child, the woman who had been given a room in the servants' quarters while she waited for passage north. Eleanor's face, when she heard this request, went white. That woman was Margaret. Margaret had not left Virginia in 1862 as Thomas had arranged. She had attempted to go north, but the journey had been interrupted by military movements, by the chaos of war, by circumstances beyond her control. She had been stranded in Richmond for months, living in poverty, struggling to care for James. And then, in desperation, she had written to Thomas. Thomas, faced with the reappearance of his secret, had done what he always did. He had tried to manage the situation. He had arranged for Margaret to come to Riverside, ostensibly as a servant, while he made new arrangements for her passage north. He had told Eleanor that Margaret was a distant relation of one of the servants, a woman fallen on hard times who needed temporary shelter. Eleanor had not believed him, but she had not confronted him either. She had simply accepted the presence of this woman in her home, this woman who bore an unmistakable resemblance to her husband, this woman who looked at Thomas with an expression that Eleanor recognized all too well, the expression of a woman who loved a man who did not truly love her in return. And now Vance was asking for Margaret to be included in the photograph. Thomas objected. His voice was sharp, his manner suddenly authoritative in a way that revealed the depth of his fear. He said it was inappropriate, that a servant should not be photographed alongside the family, that Vance was overstepping the bounds of his commission. But Vance was calm. He said that he was simply documenting the household as it truly existed. He said that if Thomas refused, he would have to conclude that there was something about this particular servant that Thomas wished to conceal. He said this quietly, in a tone that was almost conversational, but the implication was clear. Eleanor, watching this exchange, understood in that moment what had happened. She understood that this photographer knew her husband's secret. She understood that he was, in some deliberate way, forcing the truth into the open. She made a decision. She told Thomas that Margaret should be included in the photograph. She said it calmly, with the authority of a woman who had finally reached the limit of her tolerance for deception. She said that if there was nothing to hide, then there was no reason to refuse. Thomas's face darkened, but he did not refuse again. Margaret was brought to the parlor. She was wearing a simple gray dress, the uniform of a servant. Her hair was covered with a white cap. She looked frightened, uncertain, aware that something significant was happening, but not understanding what. Vance positioned her carefully. He placed her to the side of the group, but not so far to the side that she was entirely separate. He positioned her in such a way that the family relationship, or rather the hidden family relationship, became visually apparent. He positioned her so that anyone looking at the photograph would see, in the arrangement of bodies and faces, the truth that Thomas had spent years trying to conceal. And then he took the photograph. The exposure took several seconds. During those seconds, Eleanor looked directly at Margaret, and Margaret, for the first time, looked directly at Eleanor. In that moment, two women who had been bound together by the same man's deception made eye contact. In that moment, a kind of understanding passed between them. When it was over, when Vance had finished his work and was packing away his equipment, Eleanor left the room without speaking to anyone. She went to her bedroom and locked the door. She remained there for the rest of the day and through the night. Thomas attempted to speak with her, but she would not open the door. He stood in the hallway outside her room, speaking through the wooden barrier, but Eleanor did not respond. She simply sat on her bed, staring at nothing, processing the fact that her husband's infidelity had been not merely tolerated, but now documented, preserved in a photograph that would exist long after all of them were dead. This is where the story takes a turn that no one could have anticipated. If you want to know what happens next, what Eleanor does with this knowledge, what becomes of Margaret, and most importantly, what happens to that photograph, stay with us. Subscribe now so you don't miss the conclusion. The best part of this story is still to come. Vance left Riverside the next morning. He took his equipment, his assistant, and the photographic plates he had exposed during his time there. He did not speak to Thomas. He did not attempt to see Eleanor. He simply left, as quietly as he had arrived. But before he left, he made a copy of the photograph. He made it in secret, using the darkroom facilities he had arranged in a cottage near Richmond. He made a print on paper that he treated with chemicals designed to preserve it, to protect it from the ravages of time and moisture. He made this copy not for himself, but for Eleanor. He left the photograph in an envelope, addressed to Eleanor, hidden in the library at Riverside where he knew she spent her time. The envelope contained only the photograph and a single line written in Vance's careful hand: "The truth preserved." Eleanor found the photograph 3 days later. She held it in her hands, studying the image. Her husband's face, her own face, and Margaret's face, all captured in a single frame. She studied the way Vance had composed the image, the way he had used light and shadow to reveal what Thomas had tried so hard to conceal. And then she made a decision that would have consequences no one could have foreseen. She did not confront Thomas. She did not demand a divorce, though such a thing was possible under Virginia law. She did not expose him publicly, though she certainly had the means to do so. Instead, she did something far more subtle and far more devastating. She began to gather information. Over the course of the next several months, Eleanor used her position as the wife of a prominent lawyer to access documents, letters, and records that Thomas had kept in his study. She discovered the extent of his financial support for Margaret and James. She discovered letters that revealed not merely an affair, but a relationship that had spanned nearly a decade. She discovered evidence of Thomas's attempts to arrange Margaret's departure from Virginia and his subsequent attempts to bring her back when those arrangements had failed. And she discovered something else. Evidence that Thomas had used his legal position to help other men in similar situations, men who had fathered children with women outside of marriage, who needed help concealing their infidelities, who required legal assistance in managing their secret lives. Eleanor began to understand that her husband was not merely an unfaithful man. He was a man who had built a kind of business around infidelity, who had profited from the secrets of other men, who had used his legal skills to help preserve a system of deception that allowed men of his class to live double lives without consequence. She also discovered something about Margaret. She discovered that Margaret was not, as Thomas had implied, a woman of loose morals who had seduced him. She discovered that Margaret had been vulnerable, that she had been taken advantage of, that she had been promised things that Thomas had never intended to deliver. She discovered, in short, that Margaret was a victim, not in the same way that Eleanor was a victim, but a victim nonetheless. This knowledge changed Eleanor. It transformed her anger from something directed solely at her husband into something more complex, something that encompassed the entire system that had allowed such deceptions to flourish. In the spring of 1864, Eleanor made contact with Robert Vance. She did this through intermediaries, through the network of abolitionists and Union sympathizers that had begun to operate more openly as the war turned in the Union's favor. She told Vance that she wished to speak with him, that she had something to discuss regarding the photograph he had taken at Riverside. They met in Richmond, in a safe house operated by Union sympathizers. It was a dangerous meeting. Richmond was still firmly under Confederate control, and Eleanor's involvement with Union sympathizers could have had serious consequences if discovered. But Eleanor was beyond caring about such consequences. She told Vance everything. She told him about her marriage, about Thomas's infidelity, about Margaret and James. She told him about the documents she had gathered, the evidence of Thomas's role in helping other men conceal their secrets. And she told him something else. She told him that she believed Thomas had information that could be valuable to the Union cause. Thomas, in his role as a lawyer serving clients on both sides of the conflict, had accumulated knowledge of Confederate operations, supply lines, and military movements. He had information that could potentially be useful to Union commanders. And Eleanor believed that if the right pressure were applied, if Thomas were confronted with the threat of exposure, with the threat that his secrets would be revealed, he might be persuaded to share that information. Vance listened to all of this carefully, and then he made a proposal. He would take the photograph, the original photographic plate, not merely the print, and he would use it as leverage. He would approach Thomas and tell him that unless Thomas provided information to the Union, the photograph would be made public. He would threaten to distribute copies throughout Richmond to ensure that every person of prominence in the city would see the evidence of Thomas's infidelity and his role in helping other men conceal theirs. Eleanor agreed to this plan. She believed that her husband deserved to be exposed, that his secrets should be revealed, that the system of deception he had helped to perpetuate should be brought to light. But she also made one additional request. She asked Vance to ensure that Margaret and James were protected, that they were helped to reach safety in the North, that they were given the opportunity to build a new life away from Virginia and away from Thomas's influence. Vance agreed to this as well. In June of 1864, Robert Vance approached Thomas Ashton with the photograph and a proposition. The meeting took place in Thomas's office in Richmond. Vance came alone carrying the photographic plate in a protective case. He placed it on Thomas's desk and told him what he wanted. Thomas's reaction was one of shock, followed quickly by rage. He demanded to know how Vance had obtained the plate, how he dared to use it as a tool of blackmail, what he thought he could possibly accomplish with such a scheme. Vance remained calm. He explained that he had taken the photograph with the full knowledge and consent of Eleanor Ashton. He explained that Eleanor had authorized him to use it as leverage to extract information from Thomas. He explained that unless Thomas provided detailed information about Confederate operations, supply lines, and military movements to Union intelligence, the photograph would be distributed throughout Richmond and beyond. Thomas's face went pale. He understood in that moment the full extent of his exposure. He understood that his wife had betrayed him, that his secrets were no longer his own, that everything he had built, his reputation, his position, his carefully constructed life, was in danger of collapse. For a long moment, he said nothing, and then he asked a single question: "What happens to Margaret?" Vance told him that Margaret and James would be helped to reach Philadelphia, where they would be given shelter and assistance in establishing themselves. They would be safe, they would be cared for, but they would not return to Virginia, and Thomas would have no further contact with them. Thomas closed his eyes, and then, after a long silence, he agreed to Vance's terms. Over the course of the next several weeks, Thomas provided information to Union intelligence officers. The information he provided was detailed and accurate. It included the locations of Confederate supply depots, the routes of military movements, the names of officers and their assignments. It was information that could potentially save Union lives and hasten the end of the war. And in exchange, Vance kept his promise. Margaret and James were smuggled north, hidden in the back of a wagon that traveled under the protection of Union forces. They reached Philadelphia in August of 1864. Margaret found work as a seamstress. James was enrolled in a school for colored children. They began, slowly and painfully, to build a new life. But the photograph, the original photographic plate, did not remain in Vance's possession for long. In September of 1864, Robert Vance was killed. The circumstances of his death were never entirely clear. He was found in an alley in Richmond, shot through the chest. The official report stated that he had been killed by Confederate sympathizers who had discovered his involvement with Union intelligence. But there were whispers, even at the time, that suggested a different story. There were whispers that Thomas Ashton, having provided the information that Vance had demanded, had decided that the threat posed by the photograph was still too great. There were whispers that Thomas had hired someone to kill Vance and to retrieve the photographic plate. There were whispers that Thomas had decided in the end that the only way to truly protect himself was to ensure that the evidence of his secrets died with the man who possessed it. The photographic plate was never found. Vance's belongings, which were recovered after his death, did not include it. His darkroom, which was discovered by Union forces, contained no prints of the controversial image. It was as if the photograph had never existed at all. But it had existed, and somewhere, in the chaos of war and the confusion of Richmond's occupation by Union forces, a copy of that photograph had survived. Now here's where this story becomes truly fascinating, because the photograph that Vance had taken, the one that exposed Thomas Ashton's secrets, didn't simply disappear. It survived, and decades later it would resurface, carrying with it questions that historians still cannot fully answer. If you're intrigued by mysteries that blur the line between documented history and hidden truth, you're in exactly the right place. Keep watching. The war ended in April of 1865. Virginia was devastated, its economy shattered, its social order completely transformed. The institution of slavery, which had defined the state for nearly 3 centuries, was abolished. The world that Thomas Ashton had known, the world in which he had built his fortune and his reputation, ceased to exist. Thomas himself survived the war, though he was a broken man. His law practice collapsed as his clients either died in the war or fled the state. His property was seized and redistributed. Riverside, the mansion he had built with such pride, was occupied by Union forces and eventually sold at auction. Eleanor left him in 1866. She obtained a divorce, a scandalous act for a woman of her class and time, but one that was now possible under the new legal framework established by Reconstruction. She took what remained of her family's wealth and moved to Washington, D.C., where she lived quietly for the rest of her life. She never remarried. She never spoke publicly about her marriage or about the photograph. But those who knew her said that she had found a kind of peace in her solitude, a freedom that she had never experienced as Thomas's wife. William and Catherine, Thomas's legitimate children, were sent north to school. They eventually established themselves in New York, far from Virginia and far from the shadow of their father's secrets. They changed their surname, taking their mother's maiden name, Hartwell, as their own. They built new lives, new identities, new families. They never spoke of their father. Thomas himself lived until 1889, dying in Richmond at the age of 72. He had never remarried. He had never rebuilt his law practice or his fortune. He had spent his final years in relative obscurity, living in a small house on the outskirts of the city, supported by a modest pension and the charity of distant relations. Those who knew him in his final years said that he was a man haunted by regrets, a man who had lost everything that mattered to him. Margaret and James thrived in Philadelphia. Margaret became a respected seamstress, known for her skill and her integrity. James attended school, learned a trade, and eventually became a carpenter. He married, had children, and built a life that was, by all accounts, happy and fulfilling. He never knew the full story of his father's role in his mother's life, though Margaret eventually told him, when he was old enough to understand, that his father had been a man of power and privilege who had treated her with neither kindness nor respect. But the photograph that had exposed all of these secrets, remained missing. In 1923, nearly 60 years after Robert Vance's death, a photograph was discovered in the archives of the Library of Congress. It was catalogued as part of a collection of Civil War-era photographs that had been donated by an anonymous source. The photograph showed a family group, a man, a woman, and a servant, posed in what appeared to be a parlor. The image was striking in its composition, in the way it seemed to reveal psychological truths about the relationships between the figures depicted. The photograph was attributed to Robert Vance, the renowned Civil War photographer. But there was something unusual about it. The photograph bore no identifying information. There was no name, no date, no location. It was simply a photograph, preserved on paper that had been carefully treated to resist decay, bearing all the marks of age, but also bearing the marks of deliberate preservation. A historian named James Whitmore, who was researching the life and work of Robert Vance, came across the photograph in the Library of Congress archives. He was struck by it immediately. He recognized in it the hallmarks of Vance's style, the careful composition, the use of light and shadow to reveal character, the sense that the photograph was documenting something deeper than mere physical appearance. Whitmore began to investigate the photograph's origins. He searched through Vance's known works, looking for any reference to this particular image. He found nothing. He searched through historical records, looking for any mention of a sitting at a place called Riverside. He found references to the property, but nothing that directly connected it to Vance. And then, by chance, Whitmore discovered Eleanor Ashton's diary. Eleanor had kept a journal throughout her marriage and for many years afterward. She had written in it almost daily, recording her thoughts, her observations, her growing awareness of her husband's infidelity. After her death in 1912, her diary had been passed to her daughter, Catherine, who had kept it but never read it. When Catherine died in 1934, the diary was discovered among her possessions and eventually donated to a historical society in New York. Whitmore obtained access to the diary, and in its pages he found the full story. He found Eleanor's account of the day Vance had come to Riverside. He found her description of the photograph, her understanding of what Vance had done, her decision to use the image as leverage against her husband. He found, in short, the missing context that gave meaning to the mysterious photograph in the Library of Congress archives. Whitmore published his findings in a scholarly article in 1925. The article caused a sensation among historians and among the descendants of the Ashton family, who had largely succeeded in burying the story of Thomas's infidelity and his role in providing information to the Union during the war. But the article also raised questions that Whitmore could not answer. How had the photograph come to be in the Library of Congress? Who had donated it? And most importantly, how many copies of the photograph existed? Had Vance made only the one print that he had given to Eleanor, or had he made others? The answers to these questions would never be fully known. But over the course of the 20th century, additional copies of the photograph would surface, each one appearing in different archives and collections, each one raising new questions about how it had been preserved and transmitted through time. One copy appeared in the archives of the Smithsonian Institution in 1952, donated by an anonymous collector. Another copy was discovered in the personal papers of a Union officer in 1967. A third copy was found in the estate of a Philadelphia historian in 1989. Each copy was identical to the others, suggesting that they had all been made from the same original plate. But the original plate itself was never found. It had disappeared, presumably destroyed, either by Thomas Ashton or by someone acting on his behalf. What emerged from this historical detective work was a picture of a photograph that had been deliberately preserved and distributed, even as its creator had been killed and its original plate had been destroyed. It was as if someone, perhaps Eleanor herself, perhaps Margaret, perhaps some other person whose identity would never be known, had made copies of the photograph and had carefully placed them in locations where they would eventually be discovered, where they would eventually tell the story that Thomas Ashton had tried so hard to conceal. The photograph became, in the 20th century, a kind of historical artifact, a document of a moment in time that had captured not merely the physical appearance of three people, but the psychological and moral reality of their relationships. It became a symbol of the way that photography could reveal truth, could expose secrets, could preserve evidence of human complexity and human failing. But it also became a symbol of something else, the way that secrets, once created, can never truly be destroyed. They can be hidden, they can be denied, they can be buried beneath layers of deception and silence. But they persist. They survive. They wait, sometimes for decades or even centuries, for the moment when they will be brought to light. And that's the story of the photograph from 1863, a photograph that exposed secrets that powerful people wanted to keep hidden, that documented a moment of truth that changed the lives of everyone involved. The photograph still exists, preserved in archives, a testament to the power of an image to reveal what words cannot. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening. Subscribe to the channel because we have hundreds more stories like this one. Stories of secrets, mysteries, and historical moments that will make you question what you think you know about the past. See you in the next one.